So it appears that the Tyranids have evolved once more, and are back with sharper talons for higher strength in close combat, and a bunch of things that seem far more threatening against tanks and vehicles. Let's talk about all the changes in the balanced update, and what's looking good for the Tyranids going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of Games Workshop's changes for them. Perhaps one of the most extensive digital balance overhauls that they've had. Lots of points changes, loads of rules changes including their core faction rule, and plenty of specific datasheets changes as well, most of which are making the Bugs from Beyond more exciting. Prior to the data slate, Tyranids weren't maybe in the absolute best place in Warhammer 40k. None of the factions were truly dire for tournament win rates or anything like that. Tyranids getting around about 44-45%ish, but this definitely placed them towards the lower end of the game. Perhaps the more annoying thing that to even get to that point though was that they were mainly relying on things like farmed spore mines from Biovores or Rippers jumping in to do secondary objectives, and then using things like Neurolictors and Shadow in the Warp to do some battle shock and influence victory points, as opposed to the way that you might expect Tyranids to operate, smashing into the enemy, hitting them with loads of bio weapons, and trying to devour them. Perhaps one notable issue was that in 10th edition there just seems to lack anything efficient to deal with toughness 10 or higher. That was one of the major complaints. It does seem that Games Workshop have given them options on a number of different fronts for that in this change. Overall, lots of stuff was altered though. They had core rules changes to the game that affected a few Tyranids things, including unfortunately Unending Swarm, some big Synapse changes for the strength buff, lots of datasheet changes, including some flat weapon buffs and giving lots of things extra keywords, a little bit of errata and a few points changes, though mostly Games Workshop seem to have done it with rules not points this time round. Loads to talk about though, so let's jump straight into it and talk through the changes to the Tyranids. First up, one of the smaller changes to Synapse are that there's more things that do it basically. The Broodlord, the Parasite of Mortrex, and the Neurolictor all gained the Synapse keyword and project Shadow in the Warp. Previously, I believe the Neurolictor did the Shadow but not the Synapse. It doesn't seem too unreasonable to give these guys this. In 10th edition, they all had Synapse. In 9th edition, I believe, besides the Neurolictor, which didn't exist yet. I think in 10th, Games Workshop was trying to send the Tyranids forward operatives down a different sort of route, but now they've just chosen to give them unrestricted Synapse, and it's pretty handy for their battle shock defense things, useful for certain detachments rules, but now it's more important than ever as you both get a +1 strength boost around Synapse and a battle shock debuff for when you use the Shadow in the Warp. I'd say perhaps the single biggest change to Tyranids this time round is the Synapse giving you +1 strength to anything in melee. It's only helping out the close combat things, not the ranged things, but that is a pretty significant buff, as it basically falls on just about every unit in the army, provided you do the more classic Tyranid thing of bunching things up around the big beasties. It's perhaps a most direct buff for anything that's already Synapse, as they always count as being within range for that rule. So that's basically a flat melee buff to anything that's Synapse. The Norn Emissary will now always be strength 10, and that's quite a big breakpoint and makes it far more useful against tough stuff. That's quite a nice boost given that that one is the one that was taken more than the Assimilator. Otherwise, Hive Tyrant Bone Swords are strength 10 twin links now, as are all these Swarm Lords Bone Sabers. Broodlords go up to strength 7 with their twin linked, so that's a very general purpose profile there, and Melee Warriors will be strength 6, AP 2, damage 1 and twin linked. Again, that's really quite a ferocious mid-strength profile with the wound rerolls. Really nice to see just a bit more danger on all manner of Tyranid units there, from big ones to small ones. And then there's a few other things that can get some fun and interesting breakpoints from the whole strength boost. Gene Stealers are looking kind of fantastic. Now they go up to strength 5, AP 2, damage 1 with a Broodlord around. That's a profile that's going to make mincemeat of a bunch of enemy infantry. They'll be wounding Orcs on a 4+, or Space Marines on a 3 now. Hormagaunts going to strength 4 is also pretty big given their volume of attacks, and the Haruspex' more attack is 14 attacks at strength 8, AP 1, damage 2, never mind the claws. Again, that gains just a little bit more danger. Very nice if you're attacking toughness 4. It does seem like a solid boost for their problems dealing with higher toughness things. A few more things might be wounding at toughness 9 or 10 on a 5+, and a fair few things reach the strength 10 breakpoints. Otherwise, there was a small morale debuff for Synapse as well. This one means that when you trigger Shadow in the Warp, if you're within 6 inches of a Synapse creature, then it's -1 to the test. Really quite a good bonus, and that'll make a few more things fail. You can stack that with the Neurotyrant debuff as well, for a very good chance for certain units on the mid-board to fail, though as per the core rules, leadership now caps out at a minimum of 9+, even if you had some other ways to decrease it. Certainly nothing wrong with that one getting a little bit stronger. It's only for one turn, but that could be quite an impactful turn, stopping enemies using stratagems and having a good chance to just battle shot them off objectives for a turn, and I can't even use insane bravery to stop it. Next up, a nice boost for the Hive Tyrant was that his Onslaught aura now also gives lethal hits as well as Assault. I felt like Onslaught was already actually quite a good boost, getting Assault to nearby shooting to get the big monsters around terrain and into better positions without laying up the speed and firepower was quite nice. Maybe in particular for things like Maleceptors that have kind of short range on their big psychic attacks. Now though, adding lethal hits in a big damage boost to that is some pretty serious added value. Lethal hits, again, is the thing that'll be better against high toughness things. So say, for example, if you're buffing a bunch of Exocrines, then they'd be getting essentially plus 50% damage against toughness 10 or more. With a battery of 3 of them, depending on whether they're moving or not, you average around about 20 wounds or so against a toughness 10 3+ save target. That does feel like it's a pretty appreciable amount of anti-tank for a unit that's a bit better at killing elite infantry. It'll just be handy for any other shooting that you have in your army though, literally whatever flavour it is. Generally, lethal hits do better against things that you're wounding on a 4 or a 5, but they still do at least something against other targets. While on the subject of the Hive Tyrant as well, his free stratagem thing was changed quite a bit. That can now be used on any stratagems, not just battle tactics, so it could be quite big for units nearby there. It'll be interesting to take a look at the different detachments again and see which ones could be good. There's certainly way more choice out of the detachments, and could be good for other core book stratagems, things like maybe making an Acid Spray Tyrannofex Overwatch for free, or jumping in with a free Heroic Intervention, now that's 1 CP, to have one of your Tyranid monsters support another one. The negative side of the change though is that you can no longer double up on free stratagems anymore, which means that say if you're using a Hive Tyrant and Invasion fleet, you can't be putting Feel No Pain on 2 different things anymore sadly. That one's probably a small nerf there, given that that was a particularly popular use for Hive Tyrants. Talking of Exocrines a little bit, they also got buffed to Strength 9, which I feel like is an alright change. Maybe not the most super impactful. Strength 9 doesn't tend to be the biggest breakpoint in the world. It's usually only useful versus Toughness 8 and Toughness 9 targets, which admittedly it will be much better against. And I guess seeing as it's a direct buff falling on one of the single best damage dealers for the Tyranids currently, it's hard to turn your nose up at it too much. Strength 9 and potentially getting lethal hits from a Hive Tyrant out of Invasion Fleet does seem like it's quite a nice option. Perhaps the bigger and more spectacular change though was the boost to the Tyrannofex's Rupture Cannon. That's still 2 shots at 48 inches, hitting on a 3+ with heavy, strength 18, AP 4, and it went up from damage 2d6 to damage d6 plus 6. With average dice, that means that you've gone from 7 wounds average to around about 9 or 10. So it's definitely an objective damage decrease, but it's also far less swingy. You know you're going to do at least 7 wounds out of a hit, rather than it could be as low as 2. If you say had a Tyrannofex lurking in your backfield, and it takes aim at a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle in cover, you average around about 0.6 failed saves per shooting attack with this guy, which isn't as much as you might hope. But every one of those attacks that does go through has a very good chance of either crippling or destroying a vehicle outright. I feel like it's looking far more useful overall, particularly given how tanky it is. The raw numbers still add up to a little bit less damage than you might hope for the cost, despite the kind of ridiculous stat line, but hopefully it should be able to get to fire turn on turn. That average does go up a bit if the Tyrannofex can afford not to move, and occasionally it could be worth throwing a command point reroll its way. Rerolling a failed wound roll with this gun seems like a particularly good investment of 1 CP. Again, on paper feels like a fairly good change. I saw as enough buff to a Tyranid unit that's supposed to be one of the things that's best at destroying enemy tanks and armor. Next up, the Neurotyrant is now allowed to lead Zoanthropes. This felt like something that felt kind of intuitive that it probably should have been able to do from the start of the edition, really. It is basically a great big Zoanthrope, but a Hive Tyrant form of that. For leading the Zoanthropes, it'll have its own psychic damage, but it can also actually use its leadership ability meaningfully, which it doesn't really do much for the Neurogaunts or the Hive Guard that much. You get +1 to hit, so the Zoanthropes will be hitting on a 2+ with those Warp Lance attacks, and also potentially get a +1 to wound if the enemy gets battle shocked. I feel like if you've got a great big target, like say a Land Raider or an Imperial Knight or something, that could genuinely be worth trying to throw the odd battle shock test at it, maybe with Neurolictors or something. A +1 to wound with a battery of highly accurate Zoanthropes seems like it could be worth the setup. In theory, it could also allow enhancements in the unit, though most of them don't tend to be meaningful. I guess you could still just upgun the Neurotyrant itself and give it the damage dealer enhancement from Synaptic Nexus, I guess, but there's not that much that actually helps out the unit. One thing that I have heard discussed that might have been a potential oversight or bit of rules weirdness on Games Workshop's part is that the way that Big Guns Never Tire is worded means that it triggers off monster keyword units rather than models. As best I can tell, rules as written, it does sound like the Zoanthropes could get Big Guns Never Tire from the Neurotyrants, though obviously this doesn't look like it to be intentional by Games Workshop's part, and if that does indeed check out rules as written, I'm sure it will get patched in short order. Still though, seems kind of interesting on paper that you could have an entire battery of 6 Zoanthropes hitting on a 2+, plus the Psychic Torrent of the Neurotyrant. That does seem like you could have a whole load of Eldritch Tyranid firepower spitting out of them. Perhaps one of the worst changes for the Tyranids, Unending Swarm got a big nerf. One of their staple stratagems was 2 command points. When a unit of Gaunts got destroyed, you then get to place an identical unit of Gaunts back into reserve. As per the core rules, any of those stratagems have for some reason been changed to once per game only. Games Workshop seemingly wanting to stop the amount of models that you can recycle that way. I'm really not too sure what the motivation for that change was. It was a bit unexpected and didn't really feel very necessary. Now that Unending Swarm, Kroot Hunting Pack, or Guard were winning all the tournaments with this, Unending Swarm very occasionally had a bit of tournament success, though it tended to be few and far between, and definitely took a fair bit of skill to play. It felt like an army that was more viable as opposed to overpowered in any way. It does feel like a shame that that one's been nerfed. It could certainly be the difference between something like an extra 40 or 60 Gaunts over the course of a game. Though I guess it will come with a few trade-offs. You would have the command points for the other stratagems in the detachment, and there are a fair few other good ones. Plus some of the other buffs could be helpful as well. Gaunts in general being strength 4 near synapse creatures will be a fair bit of extra attrition for the foe, particularly Horma Gaunts with all their attacks at strength 4. And also the Turvagon got a small points decrease as well. That went down from 190 to 175. Turvagons were already being used in competitive in this detachment, so that bodes as fairly good news for them, I guess. 175 seems quite reasonable for what they do. They are fairly big and tanky, and can replenish the swarm and make them a bit more dangerous with the lethal hits. Still though, I think it's probably an overall nerf for Unending Swarm. I'm not sure it's nuked out of existence, but I wouldn't expect to see it in as many tournaments anymore. For the Vanguard detachment, again there were a few buffs, but also a couple of nerfs as well. The biggest assets that they gained were 3 new units with the Vanguard Invader keyword, the Morlock, Trigon and Raveners. Having monsters with Vanguard Invaders is a big boost given that most of the stratagems seem to be more balanced and aimed at lighter stuff, and Raveners are a fairly nice fast general purpose melee threat, not a million miles away from Tyranid warriors, but you wouldn't have to buy in a prime to get the Invader keyword. Those units would be able to access advance and charge and fallback and charge, potentially turn 1 coming in from reserves from the Morlock, which could be fun. Potentially a nice efficient return to reserves at the end of enemy turn, which could be done on 2 units at once, which definitely could be relevant for the Morlock in particular. They can't shoot me outside of 18-inch range stratagem, and reactive movements if you spend a big 2 CP. Again, the strength buff feels like it's going to be a relevant thing for this detachment too. A Synapse Brew Lord with strength 5 Gene Stealers seems a much buffed unit compared with what it was before. Having all of those attacks at strength 5 might be the break point between destroying an enemy unit or just bouncing off it. If you could coordinate the Trigon next to Synapse things as well, then you could get that to strength 10. I feel like Trigons often want to operate a bit more independently though. Otherwise there were a couple of nerfs to the detachment. Unseen Lurkers goes out to 18 inches rather than 12. That's the one that turns off enemy shooting, so you have to be a bit further away for that now. And the rule for redeploying units now happens before first turn is known, not after. So that's a nerf to one of the enhancements. Crusher Stampede got 2 fairly lengthy rule sections changed, though I feel like in all honesty it might have been better if they'd done something a bit different with it. The base rule now gains +2 objective control to monster units at starting strength, which does maybe seem a bit weak if you can cancel it by chipping a wound off monsters in a lot of cases. I guess that's a bit more relevant for say if you've got 2 Carnifexes and Old One Eye, that won't degrade quite as fast. I guess it gives you a little bit more presence on objectives. It's not unhelpful, but it's also not super great. Otherwise, Untrammeled Ferocity is a stratagem that was buffed a bit. This one still allows you to break out of melee, but now also allows you to smash through large bits of terrain. If you go through a bit of terrain that's greater than 4 inches in height, then you've got the chance of being battle shocked, but it is quite a low chance. That stratagem does genuinely look like an improvement, certainly won't hurt get about busy crowded battlefields, but overall it still feels like the detachment's lacking a bit of strength, I'm not sure that a couple of small supporting rules is going to change it around that much, though I guess both of these are steps in the right direction. Otherwise, for a few more points changes, there were a few alterations to Biovores, Spore Mines and Rippers. Biovores probably the most notable one, as they drop all the way down from 75 points per one down to 50. Previously, they were absolutely auto-included in every Tyranid army list to sit at the back and just farm up secondary objectives for no effort, but now Objective Control 0 Spore Mines won't be doing actions anymore. That's not going to work. Nice to see the Biovore actually drop down to 50 points again. Games Workshop recognising that the main thing it was doing was spamming out victory points in a weird way. And the Spore Mines that it spits out still have some value. You could use them to stop enemy advances in their tracks, which sometimes can make the difference between them actually getting to an objective or not turn 1. Every so often that could be a really big deal. The indirect damage output that they have though still doesn't seem particularly great, even if it does seem like it hasn't managed to fall afoul of the nerf to indirect fire, as it only hit on a 4+ anyway. Still at 50 points its damage output isn't strong. As a result, I suspect they're going to be taken far less. I'm not convinced that they're completely unusable though. Say for example if you're taking a cheap Pyrovore to sit in the backfield and do screening and a bit of area denial. They cost 35 points and you get a somewhat tough bug. I could see it maybe being worth the upgrades to trade out that flamethrower for the Spore Mine spawner, and just basically use it as a board control tool that just every so often might do a tiny bit of damage. I could see that having enough value between the Biovore doing the screening itself, plus the bonus Spore Mines that occasionally do big things with controlling movement and advances, and you might well have enough value to make up 50 points. Otherwise, for auxiliary unit changes, the Mucilid Spore went down to 30 from 50. It's still not really going to be good for actual damage output at that cost. I feel like if you want cheap screening units, then other things could probably do that better. And Ripper's got a side grade going up to 25 points on the base swarm, but down to 50 if you were taking 3 of them. Again, I feel like Tyranids probably have enough cheap units that taking individual deep strikers with objective control 0 probably isn't going to be too popular. Still, I suppose 25 points to literally just zone out one area of the board could be worth it if you're playing big movement shenanigans, but not scoring objectives is a disadvantage, and you could upgrade to something like a Pyrovore as mentioned for an extra 10 points. Overall, from the balance changes, I feel like Tyranids maybe haven't had the worst time of it. Certainly a few negatives. I feel like the biggest shame might have been Unending Swarm. Still doesn't seem to be completely unplayable, though the respawning stratagem was a big hit. I think the change from Biovores farming up victory points is actually a good one, as it seems to have been the catalyst to actually make Games Workshop try and make the army a bit more functional for damage dealing. And maybe for other slightly dud things, the Crusher Stampede changes just don't really look like it's enough to make that detachment good. Besides that though, loads of good stuff. The +1 strength in melee I think is maybe the single most meaningful change, as it's often going to be basically army-wide. Strength 5 Gene Stealers seem nice, and Strength 10 Big Bugs, maybe even the Norn Emissary, could be a bit more interesting. Lethal hits on Hive Tyrants look very nice, particularly backed up by a battery of the Exocrines that people tend to take a lot, and Tyrannofexes seem more playable. I don't know whether people will actually be using blocks of Zoanthropes and a Neurotyrant, though it seems at least a fun combo at the very least, though I'm not certain if it'll do enough to actually break its way into competitive. In general though, quite a fun update, certainly a lot to think about for the Tyranids, and lots of stuff getting a bit more interesting, and nice to have just a bit more raw punch against tough stuff in melee. In any case, let me know your thoughts on all the changes down in the comments below. What do you make of the new Tyranids, and what sort of things are you most looking forward to putting on the table? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.